Good morning. Today's Parashat is Vayigash. And in this Parashat, we read the end of the drama between Joseph, his brothers, and to some extent, Jacob. And we read there is a very dramatic scene where Joseph and the brothers are all in one room, and Joseph is confronting them and telling them that if they want to go back to Canaan, they have to leave Benjamin with him as a slave. The brothers don't know that Joseph is Joseph. They are just talking, according to them, they're talking to an Egyptian who's the second most powerful man in Egypt, right after Pharaoh. And Joseph wants to keep Benjamin as a slave. And then Judah, who has taken the leadership of the brothers, approaches Joseph, and that's what Vayigash means. He approached Joseph, and he gives him a very impassionate speech. He tells him that he's willing to stay in Egypt as a slave, but Benjamin must go back to Canaan to his family, to his father, because Jacob will die if he loses Benjamin. After hearing that, Joseph breaks down, cannot hold it anymore. He starts crying. He gets all the Egyptians out of the room and tells the brothers, "I'm Joseph, your brother, the one you sold into slavery." The brothers, of course, at the beginning don't believe him, and then Joseph convinces them that he is really Joseph, their brother. The brothers accept that. Then Joseph sent them all back to Canaan and tells them to bring Jacob and the whole family back to Egypt and to settle in Egypt. And all is well, at least for some time. Now, this story gives rise to a few questions. One of the questions that is asked every time there is a Torah study somewhere is, now that Joseph was so powerful in Egypt, why didn't let Jacob know that he was still alive? He knew that Jacob, his father, believed that he was dead, but he didn't bother or didn't make any effort. According to the question, why didn't send an emissary maybe to Jacob to tell him that he was still alive? And there are many, or at least there are a few answers, of course, different interpretations, different answers, different commentators, but I found one that I liked. And it says that keep confusing them. Joseph's position was very sensitive. It's true, he was the second most powerful man in Egypt, but Pharaoh had bypassed all the senior advisors that were working with him, and he had put somebody that was, first of all, had been a slave, then had been taken straight out of jail and made what is called, the translation is a vizier or a chancellor or a prime minister. In any case, he was the second most powerful position in Egypt, over all these Egyptian advisors. And they had to resent them, if not outright hate him, resent him, be jealous. So he had to be very careful of what he did. He had to show that his loyalties were with Egypt and with the Egyptians. In order to do that, he had to cut all links to Canaan and to his family. He had to be only to show at least that his loyalty and his concerns were for the Egyptians' welfare. The Egyptians really despised the Hebrews, and the Torah says this, when the brothers come to Egypt for the second time, Joseph invites them to dine with him. and he seats them, but the Torah says the Egyptians sat at a separate table because they could not eat together with the Hebrews because that would be abhorrent to the Egyptians. So if that was the case, they wouldn't accept somebody, a Hebrew, which had been a slave, and the prisoner, and the Hebrew above them. The other question that comes up is, why did Joseph clear the room before revealing himself to his brothers? The Torah says that after Judah's speech, he clears the room. In other words, he got all the Egyptians out of the room, and he starts crying. And there is no apparent reason for that, because the Egyptians would have known anyway that he was Joseph, and these were his brothers, because the Torah says the cry was so loud that everybody heard it, and it came to Pharaoh's ears. So he knew about it, everybody knew it. The reason is in what follows. Joseph doesn't say only, I'm Joseph, your brother. He says, now, do not be distressed or reproach yourself because you sold me here. God has sent me ahead of you to ensure your survival on earth and to save your lives in an extraordinary deliverance. In other words, he was telling the brothers, I'm here, not because I want to do something good and positive and for the Egyptians, but I'm doing it for you. So he would have told the Egyptians that Joseph's heart was with his brothers and wasn't with the welfare of Egypt and the Egyptians. And that would have been disastrous for Joseph, because it would have given more ammunition to those that really resented him in his position. And another question that comes up is why Joseph asked permission after Jacob dies. Jacob has been living in Egypt for a number of years, and when he dies, Joseph goes to Pharaoh and says, I like to bury my father in Canaan. And but when Joseph dies, that will be next week, when Joseph dies, he didn't request, before he died, he didn't request from Pharaoh that then, when he died, his children or descendants will bury him in Canaan. Doesn't say anything. Again, it's for the same reason. Jacob had been living in Egypt for 17 years. So if Joseph had said, after 17 years of being the guest, really, in Egypt, now I want to bury my father in Canaan, the Egyptians would have been offended. 17 years living here was okay, but Egypt is not good enough to stay here, to be buried here. And the reason for that, Joseph had an explanation. Before Jacob died, he requested from Joseph to swear to him that he would be taken to Canaan and buried in the cave of Machpelah, where the ancestors were buried. So when Joseph approaches Pharaoh, says, my father asked me to give him an oath that would bury him there. So Pharaoh says, okay, go ahead and do as you swore to your father. But there was no such a thing with Joseph himself. There was no excuse for Joseph to go to ask his children or descendants to bury him in Canaan. So Joseph stayed, and the oath that Joseph demanded from his children was, after you leave, so there was the expectation that eventually the Israelites would leave Egypt and go back to Canaan, after or when you leave, take my bones and bury them in Canaan. Now, the thread that is common to all these there are more questions, but these are the three. The thread here is the charge of dual loyalty. And it's a charge, an accusation that Joseph had to avoid as much as possible, completely had to avoid that. But that's an accusation that's been charged against Jews throughout history. Shabbat Shalom.